My name is Jeff Steinberg, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a very special broadcast of the LaRouche Connection. We have with us in the studio today three gentlemen with an extraordinary story. Terry Reid served in Air Force intelligence in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. He's a machine tool industry executive and a licensed pilot. Beginning in 1982, he was drawn into the Reagan-era secret wars in Central America. His experiences over the next 10 years gave him a unique vantage point from which to see the corrupting of our military, judicial, and political institutions. His incredible story is now the subject of a book, Compromised: Clinton, Bush, and the CIA, published by SPI. The book has already made it onto the Los Angeles Times' bestseller list and is now in its third printing. John Cummings co-authored the book with Terry Reid. He's an award-winning journalist. He wrote for years for Newsday and is the author of 3 other books. John is a specialist in organized crime, money laundering, and the intelligence business. Compromise drew on all 3 of those areas of expertise. Robert Maloney is a New York City attorney. He is currently representing Terry Reid in 2 federal civil court actions, one in New York against Time magazine and journalist Richard Behar, and the other in Little Rock, Arkansas against former Arkansas State Police Captain Raymond Young and former State Trooper Tommy Baker. That case is scheduled for trial in September of 1994. Probably every one of you watching this show today is familiar with the Iran-Contra affair. You're familiar with the role of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North in that scandal. Most of you have probably heard allegations that the arming of the Nicaraguan Contras involved the illegal smuggling of cocaine into the United States. Probably a smaller number of viewers are aware of the role played by Vice President and later President George Bush in those scandalous activities. And an even smaller number of you who've closely followed those unfolding scandals are familiar with a man named Barry Seal and his activities in an out-of-the-way place called Mena, Arkansas. Of course, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the more recent scandals swirling around the current occupant of the White House, Bill Clinton. Whitewatergate, Troopergate, and what some of the British tabloids have dubbed Fornegate. But unless you've read Terry Reid and John Cummings' book, or have seen the recent reviews of that book published in the New Federalist newspaper or Executive Intelligence Review magazine, you probably have no idea just how closely intertwined the Iran-Contra and Clinton-Gate stories really are. This is the subject of today's show. Terry, I want to begin by reading a brief quote from the author's note at the very beginning of your book. You write, quote, "Despite what I know about Bill Clinton's involvement with the CIA, I still voted for him. I, like many Americans, voted for change. The country had to get rid of George Bush and the outdated, misguided attitudes demonstrated by his wing of the Republican Party," unquote. You may have been very well the hardest-earned vote that Bill Clinton received in 1992. Give us an idea of how you came to be involved in Arkansas. Tell us about the Mena Project. I believe that the story actually begins in Oklahoma City with, of all people, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
Well, I feel the story actually begins in Carthage, Missouri, where I was raised and where I accepted the American value system and the obligation of serving my country. I graduated from high school in 1966, had studied in ROTC throughout high school, and was pretty much in the right age at the right time to get involved in the Vietnam War. Throughout the course of my military intelligence training, and then subsequently at Task Force Alpha in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, I became deeply ingrained into the deceit involved in the American intelligence gathering efforts, primarily the containment of the Laotian War, the illegal bombing of Laos and Cambodia. In the course of doing that, I came into play with some people who would later surface in Iran-Contra, the Iran-Contra affair, and primarily through the Air America Connection. But later on, I was put into play with some people in Oklahoma City, as you indicated, primarily a CIA agent named John Cathy, a man that at that time professed to be reporting to the National Security Council on matters related to espionage, primarily of Japanese and Hungarian firms who were hell-bent on stealing American defense secrets through the machine tool industry. In the course of that 18-month effort, I got to know Special Agent John Cathy very well. Our views paralleled, and as the book indicates, Special Agent John Cathy later became, as it turned out to be, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, working on this National Security Council, not reporting to it.
And it was Oliver North, a.k.a. John Cathy, who contacted you and asked you to link up with a man named Barry Seal and become involved in a project in Mena, Arkansas. Is that right?
That's right. In late 1983, I was being briefed on an operation that was being set in place in Arkansas. By that time, I'd been working undercover for both the FBI and CIA on the Toshiba scandal. I had penetrated that organization deeply and was reporting back about their efforts to steal American propeller technology as it pertains to quiet-running nuclear submarines. And so I was in a very prime position to be told of an effort to set in place the conduit to bypass the Bowen Amendment, which, as you know, was designed to curtail or limit our involvement in Central America.
And what was the project in Mena, Nella, Arkansas? What did they have you doing?
Well, after I was introduced to Barry Seal, as you indicated, you touched on my licensed pilot credentials. I'm a 3,000-hour plus certified flight instructor, multi-engine and jet rated. I was sent to talk to Seal initially about what qualifications I had that he may need, what expertise he could expect to draw from. Barry already had an aircraft retrofit facility sponsored by the agency or backed by the agency that was operating out of the Mena airport. I initially saw that what I could contribute most effectively beyond my manufacturing expertise was to train Nicaraguan nationals to fly aircraft. Since the Contras had no air force of their own, there was desperate need to have skilled pilots, Contra pilots, to fly their own sorties to not expose American troops to a hostile fire.
And this is what was going on up in this sort of out-of-the-way corner of western Arkansas, this training program?
Yeah, a little town called Mena, Arkansas, as you indicated, about 100 miles south of Fort Smith, Arkansas, right almost on the state line of Oklahoma and Arkansas. A population 5,000 people with a runway there and aircraft services that'll actually rival the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Very out-of-the-way, remote, heavily wooded, mountainous region of the Ouachita Mountain chain.
And you were recruited to this program by a man you later found out was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and you were, in effect, working with, maybe perhaps even reporting to Barry Seal, who was the sort of manager on the ground of that project. Is that a fair?
That's correct. Yeah, Seal. First, one must look at Boland to realize there was no prohibition for civilians to get involved. In fact, if you recall, President Reagan was openly encouraging civilians to support his efforts to keep the Contras alive and intact during times of prohibition of support. And Seal was the primary contractor, as it was explained to me, the civilian that had the contract to do a sundry of services for the agency.
I want to actually show a brief segment of a film that was prepared by Barry Seal. Seal was murdered in Louisiana in February of 1986.
Assassinated is a better word, I believe.
Right, yes. And this film was prepared sometime shortly before his assassination. Could we roll that film now?
These two men are federal drug agents. The third man is Baton Rouge pilot and soldier of fortune, Barry Seal.
Be very careful
described by some law enforcement officials as one of the biggest arms and drug smugglers in the country. But it was SEAL, not the drug agents, who asked us to videotape the meeting. This rendezvous between Barry Seal and agents of the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency took place outside a motel near Miami International Airport. The suspected smuggler wanted us to secretly videotape the meeting for what he called self-protection.
I received a sum of $10,000 today in cash and $100 bills. Payment received in payback of a loan that I made to a DEA operative who's working in this covert operation at this time.
Barry Seal is an enigma. On one hand, he's been working closely with federal drug agents in Miami and with the Central Intelligence Agency. He is a key witness in one of the most significant drug investigations ever conducted in South Florida. But at the same time, here in his hometown of Baton Rouge, the veteran pilot has been target of an intensive and what he describes unfair investigation.
I'm not a drug smuggler.
Was Barry Seal telling the truth when he said that he was not a drug trafficker? And basically, after you've said a few things, Terry, maybe John could fill in some details from his own in-depth investigation of the SEAL.
Well, let me answer that, Jeff, by saying in the world of covert and black operations, things are very seldom what they appear to be. I certainly never saw SEAL haul dope, be associated with dope, or anything of that regard or that nature. Certainly his profile or his cover was that of a drug runner. That was generated by the agency to allow him to commingle with the Medellin cartel in Central America. And it's my belief, and I stated in the book, my book Compromise, that profile, that false profile, was what was used to label him as a nefarious person, and it's what led to his death.
John, any?
Well, I was following Barry Seal's trail when I found Terry back in 1990. It began with my trying to find a connection in all of this between the CIA and drug trafficking. And in the beginning, of course, I believed Barry Seal was purely and simply a drug trafficker. But as a result of some things I had written about what the CIA had done in Florida, I was contacted by a member of the Louisiana State Police, who one night in the French Quarter we sat and he talked about how when they were investigating Barry, and Barry by this time was dead, had been assassinated, every time they really tried to home in on Barry, there always seemed to be something stepping between them and Barry, that somehow there was a force that was protecting Barry. And they said what really made us wonder what was going on is that he moved up to Arkansas, and that we never could quite figure out what he was doing in Arkansas. It was obvious that it didn't have much to do with drugs as far as we could tell. So on to Arkansas I went, and it was then when I was in Arkansas that I began to see the telltale signs of a clandestine operation. And if you know what to look for, if you had seen what I saw in Florida, they were easy to find. And it was at this point I began to look for a connection between Barry Seal and the CIA, and it turned out to be Oliver North. The person that put all this together for me was Terry. Terry was my discovery and my Rosetta Stone.
Now, Terry, in the book, you at great length describe a conversation that you had with Barry Seal in late 1985, shortly before his assassination. It was, I believe, in an airplane flying back from Central America to the United States. And he made some rather extraordinary charges about then Vice President George Bush and some members of his family. Could you comment a little bit on that? Tell our listeners about that.
Well, to sort of set the stage for that conversation, one must almost go to intelligence school to appreciate what I outlined for them in that book, in that conversation. The world of intelligence is not as it appears in the movies and 007 shows. It's about dirty, seedy business for the most part, of learning how to compromise people, control them, manipulate them, and get information that you need to carry off an operation.
Blackmail, among other
blackmail is a good word for it, although that's not the term that's used in intelligence training. Seal was a master at blackmail. In fact, he referred to it as neutralizing material, meaning, excuse me, he could neutralize opponents and control them. He was actually my intelligence mentor on the civilian side of this. He was very good at it, had a photographic memory, didn't drink alcohol, always had a clear mind, and a person who I really fondly admired, I might add. But the meeting that you're talking about was one in which Barry, I think, had amassed the ultimate neutralizing material. On that trip coming back from Ilopango back to the U.S., he was telling me that through a surveillance operation that the DEA had conducted, there had been photographic evidence attained and documentation to prove that President Bush's children had been ensnared in a trap to transport and traffic in cocaine, and that he had copies of that material, and that was his ultimate protection in an effort to defend himself against an ever-tightening noose that was developing around his neck as he was being double-crossed by agents and operatives up in the U.S.
Based on what you know about Mina and, of course, this particular conversation with Barry Seal, do you have any personal theories about why he was killed and who ultimately ordered his assassination?
I certainly do. I might point out that my co-writer John and I are working on another book that picks up where this book left off, and it's a really dangerous trail we're following, because I feel that the material that caused him to be eliminated was his knowledge of not only that, but several other key pieces of evidence that he was attaining about key politicians within the U.S. that were protecting the drug business. But let's just say this, it was certainly convenient the way he was assassinated, put on public display, pinned down in a location he could not move. They knew he had a contract on him. I mean, the federal agents knew that the Medellin cartel had issued a hit on him. Certainly at that time, he was the most valued witness the DEA had ever created. He had first-hand knowledge of both Escobar and Ochoa and their habits and patterns of movement. It's ridiculous to believe that they would take their most valuable asset and put him in a position to be assassinated. So yes, I feel, and I think we'll be able to prove it eventually, that certainly some people in very high places helped pull the strings that put him in that Salvation Army halfway house in Baton Rouge, where he was ultimately assassinated.
And if I could add to this, Jeff, Barry did leave behind some evidence of what he was claiming, which has found its way into our hands. Because he was convinced that he was being set up, and it was almost he had resigned himself to being killed, and he left behind some mementos and some, well, tape recordings with various people that are quite startling.
Jeff, several people associated with the Mina operation have died or been murdered. I'd like to point out that's the main reason well, John finally convinced me to do a book. I might point out I never intended to write a book about this. I felt that this whole story should be played out in federal court someplace to let the judges know, and then at least the inside of the Justice Department understand how out of control certain aspects of the CIA had become. But with that said, those efforts haven't been effective to date. And John convinced me that we needed to write a book, or I needed to write a book to get this all down on paper before something happened to me. In addition to Barry, his co-pilot, Emil Camp, another friend of mine, died very mysteriously in an airplane crash. Another person that we'll bring up here momentarily, I'm sure, another agent in Mexico died. People are dropping like flies that were associated with the Mina program.
In the book, you, of course, talk about John Caffey, who you yourself only discovered later was actually Oliver North. There were some other people whose names came up in the book who were initially known to you by pseudonyms, intelligence community cover names. I'd like to have both of you say a little bit about some of those other people. Let's just start with somebody who obviously was a very pivotal player in the operation in MENA at the point that it was shut down there and relocated to Mexico. I'm referring to a man who you originally were introduced to as Max Gomez. Who's the real Max Gomez?
Well, well, first of all, I'd like to say that as an operative or an agent, you're taught to not try to find out the true identity of an individual. You don't go off on little excursions of your own trying to get to the bottom of things. You're trained to take things at face value. It's your own security, your protection as well as theirs. With that said, in September of '85, I went to Veracruz, Mexico, and met a man, a Hispanic male, that introduced himself as Max Gomez. I later came to find out that that was actually a person by the name of Felix Rodriguez, a CIA agent, a man involved in the Bay of Pigs, and a man involved in the capturing and execution of Che Guevara.
And you actually originally discovered his real name when he showed up on television at the Iran-Contra hearings in the summer of '87, isn't that right?
I actually discovered him through a magazine article that surfaced during the Iran-Contra hearings.
Now, Gomez Rodriguez was the man in charge of the operation when it relocated to Mexico. Is that
As it pertains to Mexico, yes. I might point out that we've sort of skipped through the fact that in addition to the Contra training effort in Arkansas, there was actually another compartmentalized operation that of taking weapons that were being drawn from National Guard armories in Arkansas, and combined with some parts that were being manufactured for the CIA by a covert group, again in Arkansas. And SEAL was tasked with flying those weapons south. He'd been provided with two C-123K military cargo transport aircraft that he was using to fly weapons south. And now, from what I saw firsthand, he was flying cash, not drugs, back into the MENA area. And this was cash that I was initially told was to complete the manufacturing loop, the money that was needed to service the subcontractors, buy new raw materials, pay salaries and whatnot.
And at a certain point, much of that operation was sort of lifted lock, stock, and barrel and going to be moved
Lock,
to
stock, and barrel is a good selection of terms, yeah.
And moved down to Mexico, including both the manufacturing and the transiting activities.
Yeah, I was involved in the training aspects for approximately 15 months. We successfully graduated 24 students to either be pilots or ground controllers in the field to direct in the aerial delivery sorties. The Boland Amendment, the pressure was off in the spring of '86. There were a lot of indications that Congress was going to completely remove it. So there was some slack time, and it was decided that because of lax security, you had federal investigators, state investigators, county investigators, DEA, IRS, a multitude of investigations were almost ready to penetrate the whole clandestine operation in MENA. So for those reasons and others, it was decided to curtail it and move it to the Guadalajara, Mexico area.
And was there a local politico, a kind of a parallel to the cooperation that the governor in Arkansas gave to this project there on the scene in Mexico also?
Oh, certainly. We haven't touched on the fact that through the course of my working there in Arkansas, I did finally confirm for myself firsthand that Governor Clinton was aware of our operation and knew of the nuts and bolts or the mechanics of what was going on there. As I got handed off to the Mexican operation, I was briefed on another governor, actually an ex-governor in this case, in the state of Michoacan, that was cooperating with the CIA in a very, very similar nature, and his name is Cuauhtemoc Cardenas.
So Cardenas was, in effect, working closely with Felix Rodriguez on the Mexico project? Is that a safe?
Yeah, from what I could see, Cardenas was the Clinton counterpart for Mexico.
What Clinton was in Arkansas, Cardenas was in Mexico.
In your book, you've got some rather graphic language of Rodriguez describing the fact that Cardenas was basically on the CIA pad and would do anything that he was told to do by Rodriguez.
Well, he indicated that whatever needed to be done in Mexico, he could arrange to have done.
He was the facilitator, as I viewed it. I don't want to allege that he did nothing outside of the control of the CIA, but again, you had a remote state, a state that was very sparsely populated, a state that was very stricken with poverty, just almost an absolute mirror image of what Arkansas was in the late 70s, early 60s, and they were desperate. They were wanting to get their fair share of an export economy, and what we were bringing to them was high-tech manufacturing. We were going to build a facility near the city of Morelia to manufacture weapons components.
And there was, of course, in Mexico, another person that Terry became intertwined with. And Terry originally met him through Rodriguez, and his name, he was introduced to Terry as Pat Weber. And Pat Weber, it turns out, was in fact an Israeli official whose real name is Amram Nir, and is the man who has now been documented. He was the man that briefed George Bush on the Iranian initiative.
So you were in Mexico working with Amram Nir, who was also obviously an highly trusted Israeli government official. He was also privy to the Iran operations. And he was one of the people, I believe he attended several of the planning meetings, according to the way you describe it in the book, and he was one of the people you had dealings with periodically in Mexico. Is that right?
That's correct. I viewed Mr. Weber, by the way. I had no knowledge of his identity either. I viewed Pat as the linkage to the governor of Cardenas, the ex-governor. Very powerful man. They seem to go back in their relationship for quite some time, and it's no new news that the Israelis have had an embassy there for quite some time. What they do there, I think, is still up for grabs. But from what I saw, they were deeply involved in the weapons import, export, or manufacturing concepts of this story.
So we've already looked at the case of Barry Seal, who is assassinated about 2 months or so after he confides in you that he's got evidence from DEA investigations linking George Bush's sons to the cocaine cartel activities in South America. And if I'm not mistaken, Amram Nir also died a mysterious, violent death. I think it was in the fall of 1988. And is that accurate?
That's correct, yeah. Nir allegedly died in an airplane crash near the city of Morelia, right where we were putting in the facility. He died in a single-engine airplane, which I find very strange indeed, in that on the occasion that I flew with Amram, I had a twin-engine airplane, and he did not want to even fly in a small twin-engine airplane. He didn't trust small aircraft. And then I read later that he dies in a single-engine aircraft near Morelia while putting together the sub-element of a mango import-export operation. And I might point out mangoes don't grow at 7,000 feet, which is approximately the elevation of Morelia.
And if I remember correctly from the news coverage, the ID that they found at the scene of that crash was in the name Pat Weber, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was carrying an American passport.
In the name of Pat Weber, yes.
Mm-hmm. All right, now, you're down there in Mexico. You've relocated from Arkansas down to Mexico. You're working with Rodriguez and Amram Nir and getting this project off the ground, a kind of a mirror of the Mina, Nella, Arkansas effort. But it didn't last very long, at least your involvement, did it? What happened that prompted you to pick up stakes and head back to the U.S.?
Well, first of all, it was a disastrous time frame for us. About the time I got the program up and running at Guadalajara, the company's name was Maquinaria Internacional, or Machinery International, Inc. By the time we got the thing more or less limping along and up to partial speed, receiving weapons, transshipping weapons out of the Guadalajara airport, Machinery International whole purpose was to serve as a front company for that activity. As you pointed out in the intro, my background is high technology manufacturing, so my task was to set up a trading company to house machine tools. What the public was not supposed to know, or the world, was in the back of the warehouse was where we also stored large crates full of weapons, which Southern Air Transport, a company out of Florida, was tasked with moving by air. Once we got the thing more or less going, a very catastrophic incident occurred, and that was, of course, October 5th of 1986, when Bill Cooper, my friend from Southeast Asia, was shot down in a C-123K, in fact, the very same plane that Barry Seal had owned, shot down in Managua, and subsequently the whole Iran-Contra affair became exposed, or the label was given to the operation.
The crew member most people remember from that flight is Eugene Hassenfuss. He survived, but Mr. Cooper was killed.
But throughout the course of my restart-up effort, after we all laid low for a while, wondering if the organization would be penetrated to that level, and if Congress and if the media would discover Mexico. Once it was determined that pretty much had passed over our heads, we cautiously resurrected ourselves, and I started things back up. And in fact, we rapidly expanded into the manufacturing phase at the Morelia airport. But I became highly suspicious throughout the January, February, March of 1987 that my company was being used to ship things north, whereas the mandate of the company was to ship things into Mexico and house them, safeguard them, in fact, some cases recrate things and then ship it on south. But the incident you're referring to is by July of 1987, I had come face to face with the shocking reality that certain assets and agents working for the CIA were in fact trafficking in cocaine in a very, very large way.
Can you briefly describe how you found that out?
Yeah, briefly, I had to go to the airport July 5th to unlock my my facility to let an L-100, the civilian equivalent of a C-130, pick up what is called a Connex container, which is a large aluminum container that is like a small mobile home size. And inside that container, I discovered cocaine, estimated tons of cocaine stored in weapons boxes that were going north, not south.
So you physically eyeballed, I think you actually took a couple of the packages as a kind of an insurance policy,
Evidence.
the cocaine as it was being delivered to a company that you had set up for the CIA in the name Maquinaria Internacional, under the supervision of Rodriguez and a few other CIA guys on the ground there in Guadalajara. This was their operation, and your company was...
My company was to serve strictly as the front. I was to have no, excuse me, no hands-on activity within that element of it. That way I could have deniability built in. But yes, I confirmed firsthand that that's what was going on there, and I confronted my local handler with it. And by late August, it had been determined by them and myself that I wasn't cut out for that operation because of my complaining and my demands that a thorough investigation be conducted. Keep in mind, Jeff, I had 3 small children there at the time. My wife, we were living a very high-profile, legally living on the Mexican economy, but Guadalajara is a very dangerous place. Keep in mind that's the city in which Kiki Camarena,
Sure.
the American DEA
Assassinated.
agent, was abducted and tortured to death, and I just felt that I was dealing with the peripheral of that whole problem. And besides my concern for the safety of my family and myself, I couldn't live with the hypocrisy of our so-called war on drugs. If that's what was going on, I made it very clear that I didn't want part of it and wanted to divorce myself from it and go back to the States and lead a productive life in the world of manufacturing.
Now, you confronted Felix Rodriguez at that time. Did he ever make any attempt to explain away the tons of cocaine or deny that it was there at the warehouse? Or?
No, there was no attempt to deny it. It was all out in the open by that point in time. I'd complained to my local handler living in Chapala, Mexico, of it sufficiently. They knew where I was coming from, and I knew where they were coming from, so it was time to part company.
You picked up your family, you returned to the United States, and what happened to you at that point? And this may be a point where Robert might want to also jump in and give some of the legal details of it, but I think that the first thing is you found yourself, in effect, running for your life and the life of your family. Isn't that right?
Terry had become a liability.
Well, bottom line is, I'd crossed the spreadsheet, as they say in accounting. I was no longer a plus on the spreadsheet, I was a minus. I was no longer an asset, I was a liability, and I got double-crossed. I found out that these people who profess to be men of honor, that work in a paperless, contractless society, as we all had grown to understand how our relationships were in this operation. I found out that they were scoundrels, that they had very little value for the lives of the people that they should be protecting. I was labeled a drug dealer, armed and dangerous. They wanted to kill me, and then I ran. I took my family to safeguard them, and we took off and serpentined across America, hid out for the better part of 6 months.
What they did, with the help of Governor Clinton's then chief of security, is they framed him with an indictment that was a travesty of justice. A charge, an indictment from which he was later acquitted by a judge.
But as soon as you crossed into the United States from Mexico, word went out that you were an armed and dangerous drug trafficker and that there was, in effect, a dragnet put out for you. Is that?
It's called transference in intelligence school, and it's sort of frustrating to be on the receiving end of your own training. You know what's going on, but a technique to dirty one up or distance yourself from something that you're guilty of is to accuse them of exactly what you're guilty of. And the computer data that I have from EPIC, El Paso Intelligence Center, and FBI files that I've been able to get my hands on, yes, they put me in the computer in the worst possible profile, the worst possible posture for me to be apprehended by a police officer under any circumstances, a traffic violation or whatever. They were out to, all I thought of, Jeff, was Barry Seal throughout that whole ordeal. I could see myself being machine gunned to death, just as he had, just as Seal had bought the farm. I felt that was my fate as well.
Ironically, I guess it was at the point that you and your wife were both actually indicted in federal court. That was the point at which you surfaced and the arena shifted to the courtroom rather than the sort of subterranean world of ducking from federal agents.
Well, again, I used my escape and evasion Air Force training and my training as a pilot for fear control to put together a plan that I successfully evaded their efforts to apprehend me. When that didn't work, they had to fall back upon some effort to force me out. And I'm sure they knew I was alive somewhere. And the good old FBI finally showed up in my hometown of Carthage, Missouri, and interrogated my 72-year-old mother to the point that she had a heart attack. And after that occurred, that worked. I had to come forward and hope it was my hope at the time to surrender without getting shot, and I did so in Wichita, Kansas.
Robert, you weren't the attorney in that particular case, but maybe you could just sort of give us a quick summary of how that federal criminal prosecution against Terry and his wife worked out, and then maybe we can lead into these currently pending civil suits.
Well, the civil rights suit that we have pending in Arkansas against Buddy Young, Clinton's chief of security, and a man named Tommy Baker, who was a former Arkansas state trooper. That suit stems from the criminal case against Terry and Janice Reed, which spanned a period of time from '88 till late 1990. So they were in the criminal justice system for 2.5 years. Now, Jan Reed was one of the defendants for 2 years, and after 2 years, the government meekly dropped all the charges against her, claiming finally that they had no evidence against Janice Reed. They just dropped the charges voluntarily. But it was only 6 months later that Judge Frank Tice, on his own motion, asked the government and Terry's lawyer to try the case on a set of stipulated facts, after which the judge acquitted Terry, saying that the government had no evidence to convict him. This after 2.5 years of putting Terry and his wife virtually out of commission, literally bankrupting them, and causing an enormous amount of anguish.
I got to jump back a second now to one of the other people who you met during the earlier phases of your involvement in the various Arkansas and Mexico operations, who you also only knew at the time by a code name, a man named Robert Johnson. I think it's relevant because of what you later found out about who he was and the role of the Federal Justice Department in stalking you to silence you about what you had discovered in Mexico on the drug aspect of this whole business. Who was Robert Johnson?
Well, as it turns out, Robert Johnson is William P. Barr. I knew Robert Johnson as an attorney. He professed to be an attorney working for Southern Air Transport, which was a company that, of course, was a CIA proprietary and contractor down in Miami, Florida. As we transitioned to Mexico, Mr. Johnson was my contact, initially by telephone, to work out the details of how the company would be structured, set up in Mexico, how it would have an impact on Mexican and American law, and was, in essence, for all practical purposes, an attorney. I met him in Arkansas face-to-face in 1986, the spring of '86. But later on, Mr. Johnson turned out to be George Bush's Attorney General.
And of course, even prior to his appointment as Attorney General, he held a key position in the Justice Department. Thornburg was Attorney General, but he was one of the chief policy advisors to Thornburg prior to his appointment to that other post. And he was also one of the people you're saying who was an instrumental, code-named player in the entire project here.
The one meeting that I attended, that he was present, he was introduced as Mr. Casey's emissary. And certainly in the research that John Cummings and I have done in Mr. Barr, we've discovered that, yes, he was. He did work for the CIA at one time. Has a very interesting background.
Back to the civil suits. There are 2 cases currently pending, as I understand it.
That's
one
right.
in Arkansas and one in New York.
The Arkansas case is a civil rights case against Buddy Young and Tommy Baker, stemming from the criminal case. We're intending to prove that they conspired to violate the constitutional rights of Terry Reed and Janice Reed by, among other things, perjuring themselves in federal court during the Wichita criminal case, manufacturing a crime, to put it simply, against Terry Reed, one which the government simply could not prove because they had no evidence, based upon an illegal search warrant which Buddy Young obtained through false testimony, claiming that Tommy Baker had found Terry Reed's plane 4 years before that. Terry's plane had been stolen. He reported it to the insurance company, collected the insurance money, paid off the mortgage with almost every cent of this money, and walked away with literally nothing. The plane that they allegedly found, there was no evidence that was actually in the hangar that Terry had been renting. We later found out through our discovery efforts, we got an FBI memorandum that showed that the plane was found in a barn 2 weeks before the search warrant was ever issued. So that and a number of other bits of evidence we've uncovered over the last 2 years show that this was a setup, plain and simple, by Buddy Young, who, by the way, in the 10 years he had been serving as chief of security for Clinton, hadn't conducted a field investigation. This is a man who wore a suit to work. He admitted that he botched the whole investigation. So we're going to prove, in addition, the motive why this man would set up Terry Reid. And obviously, if you read the book, you'll see Terry Reid knew an awful lot about the goings-on of Arkansans, politicians and businessmen as it relates to the Contra effort.
Yet it would seem that, at least in appearance, there was an ongoing relationship between some of the people who stayed behind in Arkansas and some of the events that took place in Mexico once the activity transferred down there. In other words, you had your falling out with Rodriguez, crossed the border back into the United States, and some of the same old Arkansas characters pop up again in helping to make you a fugitive. Is that a...
Well, if I could interrupt here, it was very clear when Terry left Arkansas that Bill Clinton very much wanted him to go. He did not want him around. He did not want someone in Arkansas that had the knowledge that Terry had. So Terry was not just, Terry had become a liability to everybody. He'd become a liability to Bill Clinton, and like Barry Seal, he'd become a liability to George Bush.
And not intentionally, Jeff. I mean, I think it was through shoddy control of the operations. I was one of the very few people involved in the whole mean affair that had any formal intelligence training. As you activate civilians and bring in these assets, it's amazing. It was amazing to me to see the lack of professionalism. It was done in a very hurried up nature, and a lot of rules were broken. That's where Seal's forte, of course, came in. But over the course of almost 2 years, I transitioned through 3 separate and distinct operations in Arkansas, each one which had a different code name. So I was allowed to commingle, so to speak, throughout the whole chain of command, and that's not normally allowed in an operation of any type. So I just wanted to point out that I wasn't out writing down names and attempting to
Sure.
compromise anyone myself. It was just through osmosis that I developed an interesting list of characters. The list of characters, in fact, is in the front page of that book.
Some of the most fascinating material in the book, from my standpoint, apart from the actual just narrative, were a number of the conversations that you had with people like Neer and others. One of the things that came across was that even within the Reagan administration, there seemed to be rather distinct, divergent philosophical camps in there.
Sure.
You recounted a discussion with Neer in which he explained what the problem was with Ronald Reagan and the differences between Reagan and Bush on some very fundamental axiomatics of international politics. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd love to. In fact, let's talk about why I got involved to begin with, first of all. As I got to know Special Agent John Cathy, a.k.a. Oliver North in Oklahoma, philosophically, I discovered he and I had a lot in common, and he became very excited in our one-on-one private discussions throughout 1983 in that he was getting information that there was a doctrine being developed within the Reagan administration to totally destroy communism in 8 years or less, to literally eliminate the USSR as we knew it. That excited me. I was raised under a nuclear threat my entire life, and I thought, well, why should my children be raised like this? This is what I was trained to do. I'm a product of the Cold War. My job is to destroy this creature and get rid of it once and for all, and I felt that North felt the same as I did. I felt it was an opportunity for me to get involved in the Arkansas operation because that was our goal. Our mission was to support the Contras at all cost, not for America to get engaged in a shooting war, but as a mechanism to deflect the attention, the USSR's attention, away from their domestic problems, let them erode their manufacturing base even further, erode their asset base even further, and hopefully bankrupt them. With that said, here I am in Mexico with an Israeli agent telling me that George Bush didn't see it that way. That George Bush and his group, his inner circle, felt that Reagan was a threat to world peace, world security. That it was in essence there was a cowboy at the helm. They just couldn't quite see the big picture of things. And so here you had an operation out to one faction is trying to eliminate the USSR. The other faction is saying, no, that's dangerous. Let's keep it alive. And I was sort of caught in the middle.
You point out also in the book that one of the things that originally attracted some of these CIA characters to you was the fact that you had business dealings with people who they either knew or suspected to be KGB agents, and that there was this sort of fascination on the part of the CIA with the opportunity to, in effect, get in bed with the enemy. Maybe you could recount some of the anecdotes from the book, because I think they're rather fascinating.
Well, again, I think what you're dealing with was the effort to reach out to foreign governments and establish lines of communication through agents, to let the agents interface and become more or less the emissaries of those governments as the Cold War was deteriorating. It was an experiment, I think, was what was going on in Mexico. I certainly had worked with my job in Oklahoma was to monitor KGB agents that had been part of the operations that thrust myself and North together to begin with. Once you develop those relationships, they don't go away. I rekindled those in Mexico with the encouragement of the CIA and North and Rodriguez. And it was our hopes to put together a multinational, more or less, coalition of people down there to do what is still a little gray in my mind. And as I bring in the book, I attempted to just generate anecdotes for people to see how we interface what we were doing and what we were thinking, not necessarily draw some global conclusion to what we were doing.
Robert, we were talking earlier about the various civil suits that are pending and will presumably generate a great deal of more information and interest in this whole story. I understand that the Arkansas case is actually scheduled to go to trial at some point soon?
September of '94, we have a firm trial date, and we expect it should be about a month long.
And what about the second case up in New York?
The second case was a defamation action against Time magazine and reporter Richard Behar concerning an article Behar wrote during the presidential campaign in 1992, published in April. That article was supposedly to be about the MENA controversy, which had been in the press locally in Arkansas for years before then. What happened was Richard Behar was under some pressure to, in essence, do a hatchet job on MENA, and the way he did it was set Terry Reid up as the straw man and proceed to knock him down. One 30-year intelligence veteran that I've spoken to about this article said this looked like a disinformation piece. At that time, Clinton had just escaped being blown out of the race through the Jennifer Flowers scandal. He overcame that on 60 Minutes. But within a month, the MENA scandal was something that reporters in Little Rock were beginning to become interested in. The Nation magazine had done a series on it. It hadn't received any national attention by that point. Time magazine stepped in and did a piece which literally blew it out of the water. There are just a number of cleverly drafted defamatory statements and innuendos in that article. We filed a $40 million lawsuit against Time magazine.
And that case presumably will also be finding its way through the court system up in New York over the course of this next 6-8 month period or so, I would assume.
That's right. We are hoping to start our discovery depositions and whatnot of the reporters, editors and writers, and find out who is behind this article. We have enough evidence right now to show that there was malice intended and that Richard Behar had a high likelihood he knew that what he wrote was simply false. What he said, in essence, was MENA did not happen, and it was a figment of Terry Reid's imagination. But at the time, he had He had literally a ton of evidence from federal and state investigators and prosecutors and Congressman Alexander in Arkansas showing that not only did MENA operation take place, but there was a cover-up at both the federal and state levels, including from the governor himself.
Now, as people are generally aware, there are a number of newspapers, quite a few numbers of members of Congress from the Republican side of the aisle who have been looking for any and every excuse to stand up and attack President Clinton. It is very striking, the silence on the part of these people, the Bob Doles, the Al D'Amatos, the Jim Leaches, when it comes to the question of MENA. Any thoughts on why that is the case?
Well, I would like to say that, to me, the subject of this book is not, you know, I mean, it isn't just George Bush and Bill Clinton. What this book is about is government duplicity and political hypocrisy, and those two things don't wear party labels.
We've got an incredible story here. We've got a CIA apparently inserting itself into both political parties. We've got allegations and apparently eyewitness accounts of gun running and drug running on the part of the U.S. government. And this is a big story, which I'm quite certain we haven't heard the last of. I want to thank all three of you very much for being here tonight and today, and wish you the best of luck with the book.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.
Cocaine into the United States. Probably a smaller number of viewers are aware of the role played by Vice President and later President George Bush in those scandalous activities. And an even smaller number of you who've closely followed those unfolding scandals are familiar with a man named Barry Seal and his activities in an out-of-the-way place called Mena, Arkansas. Of course, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the more recent scandals swirling around the current occupant of the White House, Bill Clinton. Whitewatergate, Troopergate, and what some of the British tabloids have dubbed Fornegate. But unless you've read Terry Reid and John Cummings' book, or have seen the recent reviews of that book published in the New Federalist newspaper or Executive Intelligence Review magazine, you probably have no idea just how closely intertwined the Iran-Contra and Clinton-Gate stories really are. This is the subject of today's show. Terry, I want to begin by reading a brief quote from the author's note at the very beginning of your book. You write, quote, "Despite what I know of published by SPI, the book has already made it onto the Los Angeles Times' bestseller list and is now in its third printing." John Cummings co-authored the book with Terry Reid. He's an award-winning journalist. He wrote for years for Newsday and is the author of 3 other books. John is a specialist in organized crime, money laundering, and the intelligence business. Compromise drew on all 3 of those areas of expertise. Robert Maloney is a New York City attorney. He is currently representing Terry Reid in 2 federal civil court actions, one in New York against Time Magazine and journalist Richard Behar, and the other in Little Rock, Arkansas, against former Arkansas State Police Captain Raymond Young and former State Trooper Tommy Baker. That case is scheduled for trial in September of 1994. Probably every one of you watching this show today is familiar with the Iran-Contra affair. You're familiar with the role of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North in that scandal. Most of you have probably heard allegations that the arming of the Nicaraguan Contras involved the illegal smuggling of about Bill Clinton's involvement with the CIA. I still voted for him. I, like many Americans, voted for change. The country had to get rid of George Bush and the outdated, misguided attitudes demonstrated by his wing of the Republican Party," unquote. You may have been very well the hardest-earned vote that Bill Clinton received in 1992. Give us an idea of how you came to be involved in Arkansas. Tell us about the MENA project. I believe that the story actually begins in Oklahoma City with, of all people, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North.
Well, I feel the story actually begins in Carthage, Missouri, where I was raised and where I accepted the American value system and the obligation of serving my country. I graduated from high school in 1966, had studied in ROTC throughout high school, and was pretty much in the right age at the right time to get involved in the Vietnam War. Throughout the course of my military intelligence training, and then subsequently at Task Force Alpha in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, I became deeply ingrained into the deceit.
Hello, my name is Jeff Steinberg, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a very special broadcast of the LaRouche Connection. We have with us in the studio today three gentlemen with an extraordinary story. Terry Reed served in Air Force intelligence in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. He's a machine tool industry executive and a licensed pilot. Beginning in 1982, he was drawn into the Reagan-era secret wars in Central America. His experiences over the next 10 years gave him a unique vantage point from which to see the corrupting of our military, judicial, and political institutions. His incredible story is now the subject of a book, Compromised: Clinton, Bush, and the CIA.
Involved in the American intelligence gathering efforts, primarily the containment of the Laotian War, the illegal bombing of Laos and Cambodia. In the course of doing that, I came into play with some people who would later surface in Iran-Contra, the Iran-Contra affair, and primarily through the Air-America connection. But later on, I was put into play with some people in Oklahoma City, as you indicated, primarily a CIA agent named John Cathy, a man that at that time professed to be reporting to the National Security Council on matters related to espionage, primarily of Japanese and Hungarian firms who were hell-bent on stealing American defense secrets through the machine tool industry. In the course of that 18-month effort, I got to know Special Agent John Cathy very well. Our views paralleled, and as the book indicates, Special Agent John Cathy later became, as it turned out to be, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, working on this National Security Council, not reporting to it.
And it was Oliver North, a.k.a. John Cathy, who contacted you